Hello and welcome back to the Dan Cave and welcome back to another video build series. So in this build series I'm going to be building this. It's the Tamiya 1/12 scale Suzuki RGV Gamma, which is a 500cc Grand Prix motorcycle from, I'm going to say 1999. So towards the end of the two-stroke era and prior to Suzuki's last two-stroke championship with Kenny Roberts Jr. on board. So this is going to be it's going to be multiple parts. I don't know how many. I think this first part's going to run about 30 minutes. It's going to cover most of the build of the body work, getting that prepped, assemble a few parts, a little bit of filling, and then getting that to paint. And it'll also cover a little bit of the prep of the some of the chrome parts and what I've done with them, and starting work on the rear swing arm. So it's going to be a little bit, it's probably going to be less kind of formulaic than maybe some other kind of build series where it's been, with cars, it's kind of like body work, running gear, chassis, interior, final assembly. This is going to be pretty much as and when I do a bit, I'll try and release a video. So literally at this stage I've done exactly what's going to be covered in part one, which is as I just said, the kind of body work stuff and wheels, a little bit of prep on the rear swing arm. So sit back, enjoy the video, relax, put your feet up. If you've not done so, please give a like and subscribe, and I'll come back at the end of the video for a little bit of a wrap up. So enjoy the show, everyone. So to begin with, you've kind of got to open the box. So this is the Tamiya 1/12 RGV Gamma from the 99 motorcycle Grand Prix season. Everything bagged as per kind of usual Tamiya. Nicely separately bagged parts. Everything seems to be in the box okay. And I'm just going to dive straight in and start pulling these sprues out of the bags and starting to figure out exactly what I need to do with this. So for bikes, I tend to go through the instructions and mainly kind of look out for, I would say, again, kind of similar to cars in some ways. You're kind of looking for all the bodywork bits, because they're the bits that can actually take a significant amount of time. Also, in this case, the wheels painted the same as the body color, so it's basically going to be a white color. So both wheels get painted white. Looking for the fairing bits as well, see what assembly steps are involved, picking them out and just circling them through the instructions so I know exactly what I'm looking for. It can be very easy to miss bits, so it's worth kind of going through the instructions a couple of times, particularly to get that consistent body color across everything. So once I'm happy with that, I can start looking at those body panels and checking out how they look. In this case, it's the kind of main single piece fairing, and there's a nice little seam line that runs down the middle of it. So that's treated to some UMP thinny sticks just to get rid of that. Kind of slowly working my way through it. Once I'm happy that seam line is coming off. So I've left the kind of sprue runner in place for the moment, just so I don't put any pressure on the actual molded part when sanding it. But that will have to come off pretty soon, because the seam line actually runs in underneath, which is where I just kind of spot that actually, right, it's time to get these this sprue off. So before I do that, I'm going to finish off with the UMP thinny sponge, 240 sponge, I think, just to get that seam line down to where I want it to be. And now I'll go in with a set of D-Spay single-sided cutters and just to remove that sprue. So they're very good sprue cutters. They're very close cutting, so it leaves minimal cleanup work for those sprue attachment points, which is quite nice. Basically, if you cut it close enough, you can clean them up with a thinny sponge. And now I'm just going back over with a sponge sander and buffer, just to buff up that seam and sprue attachment point. And now start to remove some of the other body parts. So you've got the lower fairing bit parts, the seat and tail hump, and also the fuel tank. So it is important to check in the instructions which bike you're going to build, because there is a separate part which can go on the front part of the tank for different riders to accommodate different riding positions. So as I'm going to build the Kenny Roberts Jr. version, that spare part can stay on the sprue because I don't need it. There's a couple of parts that go on the intakes on the side of the main fairing, kind of two intake parts. They're nice snug fit, and I'm just going to use a little bit of Tamiya extra thin just to get them in place. And that's an easy enough job to do. So this particular Suzuki, so this is the 99 season, and this was, from recollection, I think it was the year before Suzuki won the World Championship with Kenny Roberts Jr. In 2000, coming towards the end of the two-stroke era. And this bike was, I suppose, laid the foundation for that championship winning season with, Kenny Roberts actually finishing second in the championship on this bike. I do have a Telefonica version also in the stash, which I think is of the 2001 version, which is not significantly different from this bike. Different livery, but not a different build. So now I'm going to start assembling the components. So this is the lower fairing part. I'm just going to use some Tamiya extra thin just to run along the seam line. Because this is quite an old molding, I think the fit of these kind of halved parts is not as good as on some of the later Tamiya kits. So generally there's often a little bit of kind of seam work to do and filling work to do. So as much as I'm trying to kind of press that kind of two parts together, you don't quite get that kind of molten line of plastic come up, which minimizes the amount of work. Pretty much the same story for the kind of seat and rear hump part as well, tailpiece. And as per pretty much all the parts, just run some Tamiya extra thin along that join line, and it goes together pretty well. There'll be a little bit of cleanup work and probably a little bit of filling work, which I'll get to later in this part. So one of the things I do like to do with these two parts is try and use enough kind of Tamiya extra thin that I can kind of squeeze the parts together as much as possible. Try and get a little bit of a kind of molten weld line appear, so that will minimize the amount of kind of seam work to be done and certainly help eliminate any potential gap that needs filling. Essentially kind of using that molten plastic to fill that line. So I think this is the mounting for the electronics pack or the MotoGP sensors, possibly, which does like the tracking data for bikes. And that's mounted from the inside. Pretty much flush fit, fits in perfectly. Fuel tank gets the same treatment, pretty much holding the two parts together and running the Tamiya extra thin around that seam line. This is, one of the areas of kind of motorbikes. I think the tail as well, they are very prominent on the bike, so it is worth putting a lot of effort into getting the seam lines pretty spot on. Now the wheels on this are molded in this kind of metallic grey plastic, but they are actually they're going to be painted white as per the instructions and as per the reference pics I've seen. So they're not the easiest to get in around the seam line, in around the spokes. And I think I generally found the kind of best amount of work was done just using the scalpel blade to basically scrape that seam line. The sanding sticks don't quite fit in as well and don't quite fit to the contours as well. Now, one of the jobs while I'm in the middle of prepping the bodywork and while the kind of two halves of each part are setting, I decided I'm going to just address the seam line on the tires. So the slick tires have quite a prominent seam running along the middle. I'm using a cheap makeup shop emery board just to clean up that seam line and rough up the surface a little bit. So I'm just running my way around, cleaning off any of the kind of rubber bits, just to make sure that I eliminate any trace of that seam line. It's one of these jobs that on cars, certainly with closed wheel cars, you can pretty much get away with because you're not going to see the tire. Certainly the kind of middle part of the tires, you're unlikely to see a seam line, but on a bike, it's extremely prominent, and especially on the rear tire. It's quite a focal point, particularly if you photograph any parts of the bike. So it is worth putting a bit of a effort and attention in just to scrub up that rear tire and get rid of the seam line. So while some of those parts, which are glued together, are drying, it's time to start prepping some of the parts for the rear swing arm. So there's parts like the rear disc, which get clipped off. There's the chain, which is on another sprue. And then there's the chrome parts, so the rear swing arm and the frame. There's also the assembly for the rear shock absorber, which is on the chrome sprue as well. And this is the point where, one of the big kind of decision points of the build for me was kind of kicking in. So initially I was kind of looking at photos and looking at the chrome and saying, well, actually, it's quite a polished looking frame in the photos. Looking at the quality of the chrome from Tamiya, which is pretty good, my initial kind of thoughts were actually I'll leave the kit chrome. Kind of saves, an element of work. Looked reasonably okay. Here I am just dry fitting the two halves of the swing arm, just looking at it, trying to make that decision. But ultimately I decide, no, I'm not happy with it. I think the photos look a duller finish, not quite a chrome finish. So actually I'm going to strip it. So I'm just starting to remove all the chrome parts. Bigger parts will get completely removed. Some of the smaller elements. There's a few small chrome pieces, so I'm going to leave them on the runner just so I don't lose them, make them more difficult to lose. Because certainly the process of stripping the chrome and rinsing it off. So basically I'm just using a cheap supermarket bleach, plastic tub, all the parts in there, and pour that bleach on over it and just cover all the parts in bleach. Now, this is a process that can vary between how well the chrome is done. In this case, for a Tamiya chrome, it literally came off in seconds. I was amazed how quickly this chrome started falling off. So that job was done incredibly quickly. I've had kits in the past where that has taken hours to remove the chrome. So those parts sat in the bleach, and I'm happy with that. They've been rinsed off and cleaned. It's time to get back to some of the parts that were glued together. Start addressing some of those seam lines. So on the fuel tank, start out with a 180 sander to take down the bulk of that seam work. There's a little bit of a tight gap between the tank mounting prongs, as I'll call them. So I just use a UMP customizable sander, just cut the size to fit through that gap. Worst part on this tank was the fact that the little dip in the tank, which I guess is where the rider's helmet chin would kind of sit in the crouch position. There is actually quite a prominent seam line in there, so that needs a little bit of filler. So I'm just using Revell model filler in this case, trying to minimize the amount that's applied because it's actually quite a hard concave shape to sand. So the rear kind of tail hump and seat part, that's getting exactly the same treatment. Using a thinny stick, 180 thinny stick, just to remove the bulk of the seam line. Again, because of the shape of the seat area, I actually decide to use some micro mesh as well, just to get in around that kind of awkward little shape. But before I get to that, I'm just going to continue around that seam line with the 180 thinny stick. So that pretty much just obliterates any kind of raised plastic, any raised seam very, very quickly. And then I will progress up through the sanding grades as required. So the gluing process on this was pretty much successful, and there's no filler required. There's a little bit of a seam, but the seat part is going to cover that anyway. So the main area to address is the bottom part of the bottom fairing. There is a little bit of seam line, so I'm just using some Revell model filler to fill that gap. So this is a solvent-based filler. It will bond pretty well. It does sand very well, but it can suffer from shrinkage. So if it's a big gap, it is something to watch out for. So on the main fairing, where those two intake pieces were glued in, I do need to use some customizable sanders and some sanding sticks just to fix that little seam line there as well, because that is reasonably prominent, but with a little bit of sanding work, it basically vanishes. So once that filler has set for a few hours, if it's applied thinly, you might be able to sand it within an hour. Depending on how thick it is, you may have to leave it up to 12 hours. I think for me, I left it about 6 hours. So once I've cut it back using a 180 thinny stick and gone back in with some micro mesh, I think it's 1500 grit, I believe. So using a little bit of water, wet sanding that. Once I've reduced that down, blended it in a little bit, I'm using the UMP buffer. Now the part I've been fearing the most, the concave part of the fuel tank. So because of the rounded edge of the UMP thinny stick, it was actually able to get into that concave gap to remove the excess. and then using some micro mesh, basically just relying on the shape of my finger to get into that kind of concave indentation, it did actually clean up pretty well. So these are the cleaned up chrome parts, which, as you can see, were molded in a grey plastic. And I'm now just cleaning up the swing arm parts, because they can pretty much go to primer as well at this stage. So I'm kind of working a couple of steps in parallel. I'm now cleaning up the rear shock assemblies. So they were originally in chrome, they've been dechromed in the bleach, and now I can clean up the seam lines. And as you can see, a little bit of a close-up, because of the shapes, you kind of do need to get in with a knife blade just to scrape some of that seam line away. Some of it will clean up with a sanding stick or a thinny stick. You can use a customizable sander. In this case, I'm using a thinny sponge just to finish that cleanup. And once again, I really need to try and get parts in shot a little bit better. So the first spray job of this is actually priming the wheels and bodywork. So I'm using UMP white primer, running at about 30 psi using UMP Apex airbrush with 0.35 needle in it. So I'm pretty much going to give probably 3 or 4 light coats of white primer. The bodywork, 3 very light coats because molded in white plastic. Just make sure you cover up any of the filled parts because the filler is a grey colour. The other challenge, of course, is to get a good kind of deep white finish on the kind of slightly darker grey molded wheels. But I think on those, I think I'd do about 3 or 4 coats of white primer, and they look pretty spot on to my eye. So it's the usual spraying process. Relatively light coats, particularly with the UMP white. You don't want to spray that too heavy. You don't want to hose it on. So the rear swing arm parts, because they're pretty much all going to be painted in metallic colors. So the chain, etc. So all those are getting primed in UMP gloss black, which I've started using recently for metallic parts, and actually I found it quite good. Actually, it does spray on well. You can't quite hose it on as well as the matte black, I would say, but it does spray on well. So again, just 2 or 3 light coats, and actually it does build up pretty well. And then maybe a final third coat, a little bit wetter, and you'll get a nice good gloss black finish. I think this is the 3rd coat on this part of the swing arm, and you can see it's got quite a glossy finish on it, and it dries pretty glossy, as you would expect from gloss black. So all in all, pretty happy with the priming work so far. Now, for the body colour on the body panels, there's 2 colours required. So the majority is white, but the lower part of the fairing is, the call out is TS10. So that's French blue, and that does seem to be a good match to that Suzuki blue. So I'm just using a straw, a medical grade cup used to collect the paint, a little bit of cling film. There's a cocktail stick in the pot. Start spraying and collect exactly how much paint I need. That'll be left to sit for probably about 4 or 5 hours to off gas, and then it'll be thinned using Tamiya lacquer thinner with retarder. So the straw is basically just cut to size and just held on to the nozzle with some blue tack. There's a little bit of a slit cut in it just to make sure it gets over the nozzle, and the blue tack just forms that seal. So that's left to off gas. We can start spraying the rest of the parts on the bodywork. And I'm using Zero Paint's Pure Brilliant White. And I'm going to put down probably 3 or 4 coats of white. So again, it's just building white on white. So actually, there's not really much of an issue with most of these parts, because white plastic with a white primer with a white paint on top. Wheels are a little bit different because they obviously started off molded in a slightly darker grey, but having 4 good coats of primer and 3 or 4 good top coats, the white looks pretty much okay to my eye. So I'm just going around, make sure I'm not going to spray any dust. If any dust is settled, I can just blow that off with the airbrush first and then start the spraying process. And I think it is about 4 coats of white I've used. So you do need to use light coats with Zero Paint. It's a very hot paint. So as long as you're doing light coats, it should be absolutely fine. And once again, proving you can actually put a lacquer paint over an acrylic primer. Many people will say you can't. This has proved you can. So this is the lower fairing. So that's been primed in UMP white acrylic. And I'm now going to base coat it with my TS10, which has been off-gassed and thinned with Tamiya lacquer thinner with retarder. So once again, I'm starting with quite a light coat to start with. Not trying to hose it on, not trying to get that kind of deep French blue color yet. Just start to build up the layers of paint and a couple of coats. So first coat is very light. As long as I'm kind of covering all the awkward little angles in around the edges of the fairings, that's a reasonably good start. And that part will be left to side to basically flash off for about 10 minutes. So once I'm happy with that and it's flashed over, I'll come back in for coat number 2. So for the lacquer work, I'm using the H&S Infinity with the 0.4 needle in it. So for the second coat, maybe going a little bit heavier on the second coat. TS sprays can go down a little bit wetter. But again, I'm not going down too wet. It's not a wet coat. I'm just building up those layers of lacquer paint. Once again, using a lacquer over an acrylic primer, which is absolutely no problem whatsoever. Same again, let that flash off, come back in for coat number 3. And as you can see, that blue is beginning to build up. Now I'm on to coat number 3. I can start building that depth of paint a little bit more. So I'm laying down a little bit more paint. But once again, I wouldn't call this a wet coat. Medium wet at best. But because it's a light blue over a white primer, it actually doesn't need that many layers of paint to get that good color come through. And then finally in for coat number 4, which will be the final color coat for this part. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. So the medical cup I've used, I've got a lid for it. I can keep some of that paint if I do need to touch up anything later. But that is coat number 4 complete. That's all the white work done on the body work as well. So that's pretty much the end of part 1. So that's body work done, swing arm primed. So let's go back to me. So there you go. That was part 1. As you can see, quite a lot of work has gone into just getting that kind of body work kind of ready. I'll just grab it from over here. And let's just stick it in the background there. So yeah, so quite a bit of work has gone in just to get, you know, everything to that state in terms of body work. you know, there's quite a bit of prep work has gone into the rear swing arm as well, you know, removing the chrome. Of course, that was done for all the parts, so that'll kind of pay back in later parts and come up again. Plus covered, you know, a little bit of kind of extra stuff like how I decant Tamiya TS sprays, a few little bits and pieces like that. So I hope you've enjoyed part 1. Part 2 will hopefully be out in the next week or so. I know they tend to be kind of 2 weeks or more. It's kind of hard to squeeze in with kind of working schedules, and you know, I've had a little bit of holiday time as well. But we'll try and get them out as quickly as possible to keep you entertained, relatively anyway. So hope you enjoyed it. If you can do, please give a like, subscribe would be really appreciated, and of course stay tuned for the next parts coming soon. And of course, if you want, please drop a comment. Please let me know what you think. Ask me any questions you want. But thank you everyone for watching so far, and we'll catch you in probably a bench update. Will be out before part 2 of this, because quite a bit of stuff has happened since the last bench update, and you know, it's now the start of September, so I'm kind of due to release another update to cover what's happened over the last month. So hopefully that'll be out probably by next week, which is a little bit later, but I've been on holiday, so you get what you get sometimes. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you all later. Bye bye.